I wish this was taking place at a lesbian bar for because I do like lesbian bars. Unlike everyone that you talk about, we'll get to that. But the next best thing would be in a at a baseball game, watching and just sitting beside you. So I am thrilled to be. I love the book. It was great.
Thank you.
And I wanted to start by sort of saying, you know, it seems so simple on the outside. Queer women's spaces, six of them. And it's like, oh, thank God, someone's finally simplified our history. But it's a stroke of genius that you sort of saw the shape of it. Like, how did you take that much history and distill it into the six spaces? And I guess while we're at it, we should just name the spaces.
I will definitely name the spaces, but first I'll talk about why I was interested in them. Partly, it really is that I'm a little bit of a hermit. And if I go somewhere, it's got to be worth it. So I really care about these places because I'm not going to go somewhere that's, under par. I've noticed, for example, that people who are really into genealogy often don't get along with their families. And I don't know if there's some similar kind of thing. You need a bit of distance to really appreciate a place. Um, and I think too, when I thought about the histories that existed, because there is some great, lesbian feminist history, it tended to be either memoirs or biographies of people or, stories of political struggles. And both of those things are incredibly important. But I thought about a book or a series of books that I love and that I think is perhaps the most important piece of literature of my generation. That's Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out For. And it, tells a real-time story of what lesbians did in an unnamed town. And they go to the bar, not very often, but they go to the bar. They play softball. They work in places like the feminist bookstore or the food co-op. The food co-op is not in my book. It's one that I kind of forgot about. I really loved seeing things happen in those places because they are very important centers of community. So the six places are the lesbian bar, the feminist bookstore, the softball diamond, which actually kind of stands in for all sports venues or sports arenas, Lesbian Land, which was a sort of series of rural retreats, a very difficult term to say, where women just got sick of, mainstream society just wasn't giving them anything. It was taking everything, and they were just going to set up on their own. And they went to rather remote places and tried to do that. The fifth place is the Feminist Sex Toy Boutique. And the last one are queer vacation destinations. Places, I'm afraid I'm the ones I'm going to name are all in the States, but Provincetown, Massachusetts, Rehoboth Beach, Massachusetts, Cherry Grove, New York, places like that where we can get away from mainstream society. And maybe it's only for a week, maybe it's only for a couple of days, but for a while we can be in a place where our cultures, our aesthetics, our celebrities, our comedy bits are the default. And it's kind of a chance to get away from the straight gaze.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very clever and it works. I find myself,
Thank
of
you.
course, putting on the glass, go, yeah, and but that. So well done.
Thank you.
And I wanted to actually tell people that, you know, we're happy to take questions or inquiries as we go. I'll do my best while sort of hosting the interview here to check in on the Q&A chat and weave in a question or two if it's possible. So don't hold back if people want to make a comment or ask a question during the interview, have at it. The Q&A is there, and that's different from the chat, I should note. So you could just put some thoughts in there. So I'll kick it off by asking you to talk about bars. I mean, it is a space like no other, and it's the probably the cliche really about, that's where women would meet.
Yeah.
Uh, can you sort of just kind of give us the broad strokes of what you mean when you're talking about lesbian bars, what era, what's going
Yeah.
on, and
Yeah. Well,
get to
in
what's
the
happening to them, but just
yeah. It is a broad story. In my book, at least, it begins approximately in the 1960s, 70s, where we were moving. Again, most of this is in the States, so that's both a disclaimer and also the history that I'll be sharing will be mostly American history, that is to say, the United States. And so in that early period, because laws are very vague and intentionally so, I should say, about things like can a bar owner serve queer people and not get in trouble? Is it true that women or people who were assigned female at birth must wear a certain number of items of clothing that are considered female? These rules were not actually clear. And because of that, legitimate business people wouldn't want to be in that business. They were going to get in trouble and they wouldn't even know if or when. So they weren't going to be in that business, and that left it to the mafia, who were happy to be in that kind of twilight world where things weren't really clear. They could do other illegal things, by which I mean things like, the numbers, selling illegal liquor, selling illegal cigarettes, all that kind of thing. So those bars, yes, they were a place that where queer people could go, where lesbians could go, but they were not treated well. They were treated incredibly poorly, in fact. In the 70s, we kind of start to see a movement out of that. Lesbians first start to manage bars, then they own bars. And across the country, there was this kind of start of the feminist bar. And this was a very tricky transition because, as with anything, there were some women in those bars who were used to the old ways, and they didn't really understand why women wore work shirts to the bar or why they didn't comb their hair properly or, that kind of thing. And then there were other women who wanted to, have a chance to talk about politics in bars. And then, there's something in 2011, I wrote a series about gay bars for Slate. And my wonderful, wonderful editor wanted to know, like, well, what do they look like? And I thought, well, have you ever been in a bar? They look like a bar. There are more women in there, but it's a bar. And so in many ways, they are just like bars, but they also face this inevitable problem. It seems to be an inevitable problem, which is, women don't go out as much generally. They don't have as much money generally.
As the boys.
As opposed to men, yes.
Yeah.
And when they find a partner, they tend to nest, I guess we'll call it. They tend to stay in. And so, that's a problem that lesbian bars, women's bars have faced for a long time. But in recent years, again, in the States, we've seen this dwindling, which often is kind of presented as a disappearance narrative. Currently, I believe the official number of officially defined lesbian bars is 32. And yeah, honestly, that's kind of ridiculous.
At a high point, how many might there have been at a peak?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to say for sure, but in the 1980s, the late 1980s, there were more than 200. So it's a huge decline. Only, I think, 6 cities have more than 2 lesbian bars, one of which is Oklahoma City, which I personally find a little surprising, but also right on Oklahoma City. And this narrative is, is just, it's a topic for, gnashing and wailing and all of those things. But to me, I reject this kind of this disappearance narrative. Having lived in the 1980s and gone to bars in the 1980s, because there was nowhere else to go, nowhere else where you could express affection, where you could, openly, be partners, where you could be maybe not sexual at a bar, but let's just say libidinous, where you could, dance intimately.
Oh, I think people were being sexual in a number of bars.
Well, it depends on exactly what we're going to define. But yes, I'm not going to strongly disagree.
The Boom Boom Room had a cage.
Okay.
In fact, people in the chat should probably just throw the names of the Toronto bars. There was
I would love to hear
that. Pretty active scene.
Yeah.
A lot of people my age would know the Chez Moi and the Rose on Parliament Street were the big ones. But there was many, and I was part of a group of women who really liked going to the bars. It was fun. It was a
Yeah.
night out. It was Friday and Saturday night, pretty much de rigueur. Ride our bikes over to the bar, dance, 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 drink beer. Usually go home in the same group that you arrive, but
Yeah.
maybe
So
someone met,
maybe not.
things could happen, or they come back to the group house
Yeah.
and we watch some bad movies and carry on through the night.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'm interested, like, it there's more than just drinking beer and dancing going on. Like, putting on your sociologist kind of hat, June, in a deeper way, like if you were narrating to aliens from another planet, what is really going on in that bar?
Well, I think a lot of the time, and again, there has been some evolution, but still today, I think there's a lot of similarities with why did women go to bars in the 1970s when it was seriously dangerous? 60, 70, it was a
Yeah,
dangerous thing. Yes, it was a lot of fun, but if you were seen in there, if a bar was raided, you could lose a job, you could lose a home,
use
you
your
would
kid.
lose your kids.
Yeah,
There was some serious danger attached to it. A little bit less today for most people, but I think people still go for the same reasons because um, when you realize that you are queer in some way or other, you know that you will need a separate socializing space, separate third space. It's not to say that you won't go out with your college friends, with the friends that you grew up with the folks you work with, but unless they're gay too, you're going to have a separate social life, and you have to. And where do you do that? Well, for most people, the answer that they know, even before they know anything else about being gay, is, well, you go to a bar. So
yeah,
they're often that threshold place,
yeah.
and they can. And I should say, I think a lot of people read the book and think I'm against bars, and I'm not. I've had fantastic times in bars, and crummy times, but that's how everybody
Yeah,
experiences any place.
yeah.
But they, especially in recent years, they have been places for organizing. They're a place where you find gay people. So if you want to, make people aware of, for example, perhaps not in political campaigns for individuals, but during the quest for marriage equality in the States, certainly, there was some fundraising, there was a lot of awareness building in bars. They're a place to find other gay people. They're that first contact.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, you're alluding to it. You've said you were a bit of a hermit. I think we might be a little different that way. Uh, but they weren't to everyone's taste,
They were not.
which is, what are some of the downsides to bars, which then push people into other sorts of social spaces? But what didn't work for some people about bars?
Well, the first one is booze. For the default space to be a place which exists to sell alcohol, which, is the purpose of every bar, it's not ideal. It's not ideal if that is the space. It's a problem for some people. And, so also there are things like, again, in the US, starting, I guess, in the 80s, and certainly now, you have to be 21 before you can go into a bar. So that is the key perhaps, homosocial space from which they're excluded. That's a problem that I think is pretty unique to the States, but it's a big one. They tend to be located for various, actually, I don't know if they're sensible, but for rational reasons, on the outskirts of town. It's nice that in Toronto and in places like New York, you can get there either on public transport, maybe you can ride your bike. In many cities, though, they tend to be located on the outskirts of town or in, let's just say, dodgy neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And, that's not ideal, especially, let's face it, if you're a hipster like me, you wouldn't dare, you wouldn't think of going before midnight. That's kind of not ideal too.
Yeah.
So, this is a problem with all bars and clubs. But when it's your own, well, when people think it's the only place they can go, it can become a problem. And also because there are so few, it's not exactly this brilliant selection that we have. Again, there are 6 cities in the States that have more than one
Yeah.
lesbian bar. So generally speaking, if you want to go to a lesbian bar in most of the United States, you have one choice. Again, I think that actually lesbians and queer people, queer women now are more open to going into more inclusive queer spaces. So that's a major evolution, a major change. So
And of course, you know, the lesbians bars proper may have sort of decreased dramatically, but the types of mixed spaces or roving parties that take place in bars are, you know, have increased, have sort of appeared,
absolutely.
become the dominant sort of party scene.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, so, um, you know, I wanted to ask, you know, like, so you have people who either, you know, don't like the noise, don't want, you know, stay up late, don't like booze,
Yeah.
don't like it, or can't be around it. There's a lot of people not served by that. So what were their options? Where might a lesbian go and find another lesbian if they don't want to hang out in a bar? I mean, I guess actually, I want to talk about the bookstores actually.
Yes. My
Uh,
favorite place.
yes. Oh,
Uh,
really? Okay.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, and something tells me, Jane, that you're rather a bookish person
A
too.
little bit
So
of books. You know, I'm an
a
old
little
man,
bit of books.
like bars, books, ball fields. I love it all.
Yeah. I mean, first there was this conscious movement to find what was always called, almost always the same language, an alternative to the bars. And there were, you know, some were bar-like spaces, restaurants, cafes. But part of the origin of feminist bookstores really came out of that wanting to have an alternative to the bar. And feminist bookstores, yes, were bookstores. Yeah, I think everybody here knows what a bookstore looks like. But this was really about the ideas that were in those books, wanting to create a place where women could come to find, you know, these new ideas that were being, you know, just that were coming out of new presses that were being founded by feminists, by lesbian feminists, these magazines that were, you know, covering these developments, the music that reflected the changes that were happening in society. And they were also a place to meet. They were a place that was typically
Oh,
downtown.
let's not forget the bulletin board at
The
the
bulletin board.
bookstore. You know,
Yeah,
that
and
itself was basically a community center, like roommate wanted, jobs, you know, when's the next parade or, you know, demonstration. I
yeah,
mean, these were the cultural centers.
they absolutely were. I mean, and again, I think it's one of the, you know, I never want to sort of, you know, idealize these places from the past. You can't turn back the clock, but I wish it were possible to see them for women of today who are grown up today who weren't there at the kind of the apex of the feminist bookstore movement, to be able to see just how much they were a community center. You know, one of the great ones, Old Wives' Tales in San Francisco, on their bookmarks, which is, you know, basically their main marketing tool, because they certainly had no money for any other kind of marketing. They put on the last item on the bookmark that listed all their great assets was bulletin board. So I asked Mary Farmer, who was a longtime owner of Llamas, which was the feminist bookstore in DC, in Washington, DC, you know, why you were a store, why did you have all those binders taking up precious shelf space? Because there weren't that many shelves and there were a lot of books to get in them. And she said, well, I didn't plan it that way, but people knew it was owned by lesbians. People knew there were lesbians who worked there. People knew it was a safe space where you could ask those questions. So people would either come in or they'd call on the phone and say, sometimes they would ask about books, but a lot of the time they were like, do you know a doctor who's not going to hurt me? Do you know where I can get a roommate who will not be discriminatory? Do you know who I can, you know, have a lawyer who will be able to help me, you know, keep my kids and not charge a fortune? Yeah. So they definitely became community centers, not exactly against their will, but not necessarily their first intention.
No, and I mean, what it creates, however, is a situation where people feel pretty invested in that bricks and mortars bookshop. But there's a place where the rubber meets the road where it's about also making money, right? So becomes a contested domain where people feel that they have a right or a prerogative to be in that space because it's Toronto Women's Bookstore, or Glad Day Books being a historic gay bookstore in Toronto. But it becomes difficult to navigate the various requests or desires that people have for this bookstore to be much more than selling books. Can you talk about that? Like how that, and how that may lead to the demise of some bookstores, or how they dealt with that multi-pronged sort of functionality and a very high density of politics.
Yeah, it's a very good way of putting it. A high density of politics, yes,
Yeah.
and very strong feelings. And certainly that was the case for all of these spaces. They were so precious that we cared about them almost too much, and it made it almost impossible for the owners or for the collectives who ran them to be able to navigate, as you said, the tensions and the competing priorities. I think for bookstores, actually, was probably the place where it was least contested, because their mission was very clear. They wanted to get these books and all these other things that they had in the store into the hands of women, and I can't say that they ignored capital, the imperatives of capitalism, but they certainly weren't their first priorities. So they cooperated instead of competed. One of the things you can do in a bookstore, you can return books for credit, but the feminist bookstores hardly ever did that, because what was on the shelves, like, that was their project. That was what they were there for. It was to collate and curate this selection of books so that if a woman came in and she needed to know about whatever it was, she would find it would be there. So they never played those games. And, we saw that in all kinds of spaces. I mean, but actually, I think it was in bars that this came out more, where, again, there weren't that many of them. And so it became so important. And women, in Portland, Oregon, women pasted on the door of a bar, "This bar exploits women." And when, the women from a local feminist newsletter sort of asked the people who were complaining, what were the issues? They said, well, the beer is a little bit more expensive than at the men's bar down the street, and we can't talk about politics, and you keep letting men in, and you won't play women's music. And there was the owners had a response to all those things. They had to charge a bit more because it was a new bar and they were renting their equipment. And the other things, you had to let men in. It's the law. Nobody plays women's music. Nobody allows.
Can't dance to it.
Yeah, and they said, well, the men's bar doesn't do those things either. And they said, yeah, but this is a lesbian bar. This is our bar. You should. And like that is a very difficult tension to negotiate. But also, I completely get it. It's so precious. When you have very little, you care about it a lot, possibly too much.
You just sort of enumerating that list of, basically square holes that can't be, square, circle, egg, can't fix it. I'm traumatized. It's like, oh my God, I'm remembering now what it was like to be a lesbian in the 90s.
You remember those collective meetings? I'm sorry for the flashback, but it happens every time.
It's hilarious. But you love it because now, if we could talk for a moment, it's not Toronto history, but if the Michigan Women's Festival was such a high watermark for me, because what they did was they figured out a way for a long time, not forever for everyone, but for a long time, to accommodate so many different people who needed to be, I want to hear only Holly Near. I want to only wear the clothes on top, not on the bottom. And I don't want perfume to be worn near me or my 4-year-old child. Like, they were a model for sort of going, you know what, let's treat it like an improv. Yes, and yes, and yes, and until, of course, things happen.
The big no, but yes.
This way that it takes us to be in the lesbian community to to try to find ways to stay together. There's not enough of us to kind of push out into all, like, it's not like the boys. They had a ton of different bars to pick from all the time. You sort of had to get along. Is a great thing about the community, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's it's both. It's an asset and a defect. I don't know. Yeah. And I just want to say that I agree with you about Michigan, but I also note that it was a very large piece of land. And so, as you said, the great idea that they had was, you don't want perfume, and again, perfectly reasonable point of view. You go over there where we can not have perfume. And
Scent-free.
that worked for
The
them for a
original
long time.
scent-free.
Yeah, exactly. And that worked for them for a long time, but most spaces that we are able to gain access to, again, because they're chronically undercapitalized in pretty much every case, that means there's too little space and too little money to promote it.
Mhm. Actually, why don't we just sort of roll into the whole lesbian land movement as sort of a natural
Mm.
I mean, I want to get to sports. I think it's a
Mm.
really interesting that your take on it's been really interesting. But communes, collective living, co-ops, off-grid, back to the landers,
Yeah, yeah.
and family enclaves, incredible range. So if you could just, if people haven't read your book yet, just sort of say what the lesbian land movement was and the great breadth that it had.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned lesbian group homes, because I think many of us, maybe most of us of a certain age, spent time in one. Oh yeah, me too.
Oh, yeah.
And
That's where I learned how to cook, love,
yeah,
be friends, be a roommate, be an idiot, and then and still be friends.
Yeah. And they were, I think, lots of people live in group houses, but again, I think they were more important to queer people, to lesbians, because we didn't really, or I should say, very, very few of us got that chance to figure out those things that you just mentioned at home. Because even if we had parents and family members who were supportive, they didn't know anything. And so what we didn't know, and we kind of needed to learn that in the company of other people who were going through that same struggle, or maybe some slightly older women who could, in a way, teach us or model it for us, I guess. Yeah. So the group houses were extra important. But for some women, that wasn't enough. They found, and we're talking now mostly about the 70s and 80s, they found society to be just killing them, that they wasn't supportive, that they were being harassed, they couldn't thrive. And their misery was so profound, and their hope for finding something else was so strong, that they decided they were going to start something else. And they were going to get away from men. They were going to get away from straight women. They were going to get away from everything and start over. They were going to form a parallel society. And the place where they would do this would be on land, in rural locations, remote, because it was cheaper. They couldn't do it in the city. And anyway, it was too hard to get away from men.
Couldn't be separate. It was about being lesbian separate, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they went off to these communities, and they founded communities, and it was very, very hard, because they couldn't afford good land, and they wanted to be far away. So it was isolating, and they didn't want people to know, who were already there, to know too much about them, because they had, I think, a very well-founded fear of harassment and worse. And so they were incredibly isolated, and they did incredible things. They formed very strong bonds with nature. They were able to experiment sexually, socially, because there wasn't anyone else there keeping an eye on them. It was an incredible, it was a place of great liberation. Spirituality was developed there.
Pagan,
pagan spirituality. They could be. There's a lot of writing, a lot of photography that mostly was kind of in community. We didn't really see much of it outside of this.
Blood art, I'm sure. Got it.
I mean, there. But so much. but yeah.
So June, tell me just what the range of land, organizations were, 4 people right up to 50, or polyamorous,
mostly they were small groups, and there was so much change that and also because they were, I don't know that secretive is the right word, but they didn't really share too much outside. It's very hard to come up with real specific things. There were probably about 150 around the United States, but they were mostly in places like Oregon, in the Ozarks, in the kind of Northeast, that Vermont, kind of getting close to Canada there, some in PEI, and obviously in Canada. But it was very, 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 very hard. I cannot stress how hard it was. And so it was only for the most hardy, or really the most the people who just they didn't care. They were done with mainstream society. And so people who stayed tended to be, the absolute holdouts. And these women who are still there, there are several communities. There are 3 feminist bookstores at least that have been open for more than 45 years. There are dozens, I mean, low number of dozens, but dozens of women's Landijk, as they call themselves, Landijk communities that are still in operation, but they tend now to be mostly older women because it's not so appealing either philosophically. Lesbian separatism has waned in interest, and also just the isolation, especially in this connected age, is no longer appealing, and also the sort of the transgender attitudes, are no longer really in the mainstream of queer women's and lesbian culture.
I wanted to recall reading in your book that this is quite interesting, that one of the issues that led to the downfall of many of these experiments was a really different understandings around work and how work was collectivism. So there's an impulse, there's a great generosity that starts it off, like, I'll do more of the hard work then, and then you'll do this, and complementarity and so on. But sometimes it doesn't always work. Can you tell us, give us a few examples where, the desire to be all collective just broke down?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard. It's so hard. I mean, did every group house that you were in an urban environment work out? It didn't. And when you are, 4 was actually a typical number, I think. 4 to 10 would be a very large community. Getting together, getting along when you are each other's everything. You're working there, you're sleeping together most of the time.
Like exes, or you might be
exes, currents, or poly situations. So you've got work, love, your entire life. And again, at this point, very few of these communities had telephones. This is before the internet. Many of them even now have very poor internet because they are rural women who, we know in general, rural people do not have as much access to these things. And yes, work was extremely contentious because a lot of women had moved to the land to heal from the damage that mainstream society had done to them, that the patriarchy had done to them, and others on these land groups where work needed to be done were like, sister, I want you to heal, but also we need wood.
We need some firewood for the winter. Yeah. The window is
And the other thing that surprised me was that often the work that was hardest to get done was what we would typically code as women's work. That women were kind of, if they were able to work, they would want to cut down trees and build houses and do these big kind of, high priority, big prestige jobs. But, making dinner, doing the washing up, those weren't so popular.
It's just super interesting, right? And it kind of scans. Like, I didn't want to join the lesbian army and be the housewife,
Yeah, exactly.
But, that's how we're did. So that was that whole chapter that was fascinating. It was just great to see that information gathered in one place because it's out there. I'm really happy to see that you've done a great job of pulling stuff together. It's such a fascinating social experiment.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we could turn our mind to the ball fields.
I know that's where you want to go, Jen. You love that ball field.
That's right. I was a little tomboy and a big jock, and I played all the sports. And then, around 16 or 17, I thought, I want to be a writer, though. I want to be an artist. So I just sort of thought, I have to quit all my sports and start smoking immediately. Which I promptly did. I think it was really unfortunate. It was just in that generation where it was changing. There started to be pink turf soccer, not so Amazon baseball in Toronto, like women and women's hockey as well. So, I just kind of missed that deadline, but I sort of got quite involved in the arts and writing stuff. But Wow. There's so many options now, but
Yeah.
just you sort of hypothesize women and sports as a way that women can meet
Hmm.
and be with each other and in a sort of gender performance that's not conventional.
Yeah.
Maybe sort of lay out your understanding of what's going on there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another thing that happened in that era that you were talking about was that sports were coded lesbian. And so again, many women who enjoyed sports and were good at sports and got a
Sure.
kick out of playing sports were kind of pressured into,
Suspect.
well, so are you a dyke? And so they stopped doing something that they really loved.
Mm.
Um, and and yet nobody quite knows why. In the States, there's a theory that factories where conditions were terrible, the owners were pressured to do something for the workers, and they suggested playing sports. And because women who worked outside the home were statistically more likely to be lesbians, or there were going to be more lesbians represented in that group, maybe lesbians played softball. And it in the States, at least, it became the kind of the default lesbian sport. And again, it's another space. It's another type of third space because it's outdoors. It's in the sun. You can't play softball indoors. And for the most part, it's in public parks. So you also those don't close down for the most part. Sometimes we do
Yeah.
change the cities, but it's unusual. So it's a very, very public space. And it's an opportunity. And in the 70s, again, some political women, one of the stories I tell is in Atlanta, this group of political women who started a group. It's called the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance, ALPHA. And they were very political women and they wanted to expand their group. And they knew that softball was big in the South. Many of them were, not all, but many were kind of transplants to the South. They'd gone there to do political work. And they also wanted to kind of figure out the joy of sports, to
Mhm.
be using your body, to be like, doing that, making that great throw, to hone your skills and to be supporting each other. And for the political women, it was also, if you were alpha and you had a team and you were playing in places where maybe women had never, still in the 70s, which is state, had never heard the word lesbian until it was called out before, when the umpire was introducing the players and introducing the teams, they would say the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance. And one woman who played on that team back then said, that was revolutionary.
Yeah.
And so
About
it was
taking up
great.
space.
Yeah, it was great for the women. They got to learn to be athletes. Maybe not the greatest athletes, but they'd never, this is before Title IX in the States. They'd had no coaching. It wasn't something that was encouraged, and it was revolutionary for them to learn, the joy of sports.
Yeah.
And it had a political aspect.
Mhm.
And even now, it's a place where women can find friends. It's just so hard to find, for any adult to find friends.
Mhm.
And, being on a ball team is a great one.
And there's no booze and it's healthy, it's outside,
Yeah.
and you also, you're looking at women who are, flexing their muscles. They might have, bare arms and legs. And I mean, it's not a bar, but you can't say it's not sexy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what I believe is called a multi-purpose environment.
Yes. So, you write about how there's an ongoing negotiation between the urge to be competitive in women's and lesbian sports and the
Yeah.
urge to just give out the participation medals. Um,
Yeah.
how did baseball or soccer, how did they deal with that tension?
Well, I think it's because softball was the early, again, in the States was the game where this first played out. Again, because women hadn't had training, they hadn't been encouraged, they hadn't been coached. So, for example, in Northampton, which is in Northampton, Massachusetts, which because of the kind of confluence of colleges, including several women's colleges, traditionally is kind of known. I wonder if it's still true as like the home of American lesbianism. There was a league that was started from women at the beginning. We were going to teach women how to play softball. We're going to teach women to get involved in sports. We're just going to encourage them. And there were very strict rules about not being too competitive. They've never kept standings. The league, which was started in the 70s, still exists, but they've never kept standings because it's not about competition. It's about the joy of playing. Well, this is great. And for many women said, I wouldn't have felt comfortable not feeling that I had any skills going into an established team, a real team. I just wouldn't have felt confident. But it helped women build confidence and experience the pleasure of teamwork and all of those things that we've been talking about. But it also did frustrate some women who were good at sports. So like, this is like the days when all we could eat was tofu and beans, we don't have to live like this, but I think now there are alternatives, and the women who choose to play in the Mary Vasquez League want that kind of camaraderie and not to play. And many of the other leagues have kind of what one person called a more chill league. You let the women who want to compete and really go, and not
there's
anything
enough,
go by.
like in hockey. But
Yeah.
I also want to ask about, how communities, how integrated the sports and even the bars were, that, sort of, were they inclusive and quite diverse? And of course, there's not one answer, but maybe to speak to how race and identity and ethnicity played into how these spaces worked.
I mean,
and bars included.
Yeah, one of the things, it's funny, as I've only done a few kind of talks in public, but to kind of, I guess I should say what I'm about to say and then come back to that. But I would say they were more inclusive and more consciously inclusive than men's spaces. There was a sense, that lesbians, not exclusively, certainly, and it's certainly in some of the environments, but many were lesbian feminists, or at least had some, they had some interest in feminism, even if they weren't in a collective and, going to meetings 4 times a week. But no, bars often, for their own reasons, would, maybe use familiar tricks. They would use the dress code wouldn't be applied equally. Women who wore an outfit would be allowed in. Black women who wore the exact same outfit, more or less, would not be allowed in. They didn't meet the dress code. Or, the forms of ID, often Black women were asked for multiple forms of ID because again, for that 21, that's a thing in America. And so you always have to have somebody at the door. It's a kind of one of the pernicious aspects of this 21. That you've got the person at the door looking at the IDs, and they would ask for more for women. But again, one of the kind of integrative parts of it, that, women wouldn't just go to one thing. They would be on a ball team and they would go to bars, and they would, so one story that I tell is how, there was a particular bar, and then this bar would do these kind of party things where they go to different bars, and women who were playing softball in Brooklyn, they were talking about where they'd gone and where they hadn't been allowed in. It's like, you know what? There's a pattern here. This company isn't letting Black women in when they are a group of Black men. If they're with white women, well, they'll let them in.
Yeah.
So they then formed an organization. They went to the women's martial arts dojo where many of them trained, and they organized, and they formed this organization called COOL, the Coalition of Outraged Lesbians. And they would picket, when this bar that this organization that they felt discriminated against women of color, they would protest. But, the fact is, women still went in. They would protest, and they would be pointing out the policies and the history and some of the things that had happened, testimonies from women who'd been denied, and women still went in the bar. So, women, I think, are better than men in certain respects as far as, living their politics goes. But they're not perfect.
Exclusion was still a factor. It was just constituted, and of course it was found in these spaces also.
Yeah, lesbians, it's sad to say, they don't create utopias. They do. Many of the places that we build still have the same, problems that we see out in the larger world.